In 1950, a precocious young PLA officer named Li Zhengfu was handed a note that was cryptic, if not disturbing. Li was young for a battalion commander, only 23. But then again, he'd started fighting Japanese as a guerrilla soldier when he was only 13. This note told him to report at once to the divisional commander and bring along a hand-picked security guard and something called a Siyang who is a specialist in the care and feeding of livestock. They should all be fully armed and kitted out, and they would not be returning to their unit. Even the divisional commander had no idea what was going on. He just told Lee and his two men to get on a horse-drawn cart and said that they were going somewhere that would be probably really harsh. Friends, when someone who has been bayoneting people on a professional basis for 20 years in third world dirt warfare tells you you're going somewhere harsh, buckle up. During their journey on the horse-drawn cart, Lee and his men were intercepted by a messenger who brought them to a train, still with no idea where they were going. When the train got to Wuhan, an aide from the military district headquarters took them to a hotel where a bunch of other soldiers had been gathered, and everybody was being issued civilian clothes, raincoats, leather shoes, which were quite a luxury in those days, and speaking of luxuries, a Swiss watch, and an English-made fountain pen. Then Lee and all the other soldiers present were huddled together for one of those group photos that Chinese people cannot live without, and then they were finally told, "You are all going to fight in Vietnam." Friends, welcome to Type 56, the story of China's army. I'm Jason Clower. Afghanistan has been called the graveyard of empires, but I think I'm calling stolen valor on that because it doesn't hold a candle to Vietnam. In Afghanistan, the Soviets lost 15,000 men in a decade of fighting. The coalition, led by the United States, lost something over 3,000 in 20 years. But when it comes to Vietnam, when China invaded, they lost more than that in a month. The United States lost 58,000, and the French Union lost upwards of 90,000 combatants dead. How in the world could you get such an appalling body count from just the dinky little Vietnamese communist forces of the 50s and the divided, paralytic French Fourth Republic? Well, it's because it wasn't just a war between France and wizened little skinny Ho Chi Minh. It was a proxy war. And behind Uncle Ho stood Chairman Mao and the People's Liberation Army. In 1950, all over the PLA, random officers like Li Zhengfu were getting hush-hush orders called down to the Wuhan military district and then sent down to Guangxi on the southern border with Vietnam. This was all very confidential, but if anyone outside of Chairman Mao and his inner circle were aware that dozens of officers were being quietly stripped out of their units and sent south, they would have struggled to find a pattern that explained why these particular people were being chosen, unless they knew who the leader of the group was. Wei Guoqing was an army officer who was being prepared to take off the uniform and go to the UN to represent the Chinese Communist Party. He was from the province of Guangxi, down on the border with Vietnam, and he came from a minority ethnicity called the Zhuang people. Since he was a young man, he had been fighting with the Communist Red Army against the Japanese and then against the KMT. He was an expert in what the communists called Sparrow War, which is to say pot-shotting, guerrilla warfare, classic SKS stuff. He had been a military engineer, a political officer. For a while, he had been the commandant of a Red Army military school. He was well educated by PLA standards. And he also had a lot of combat experience as a former divisional commander. And he had been part of the invasion of Fujian province near Taiwan and had transitioned from military office to being a civil administrator. He was also newly married, and he and his wife were staying in Beijing, getting ready to travel as diplomats to New York. Then suddenly, he got a call telling him everything had changed. Wei was brought in and told, "You're an ethnic Zhuang from near the Vietnamese border. You know they need help." Friends, we often forget that up until 1949, it was Ho Chi Minh and the Communist Party of Indochina who were really better connected, better funded, better educated. Ho Chi Minh was a linguistic freak who spoke French well, Mandarin, Cantonese, Russian, pretty well. He could stumble through English. I'm told he knew Esperanto. People also claim Italian and German for him. But now that Mao and his crowd had taken over not just any country, but one of the world's great countries, now it was Ho's turn to get help from them. And the Army High Command told Wei Guoqing, the reason we need you is that Ho's Vietnamese People's Army has been doing fine with guerrilla warfare. But it's time for us to help them turn up the heat on the French in Indochina. And for all its merits as a guerrilla outfit, the Vietnamese army doesn't know diddly about brick bat hitting conventional warfare. Wei was told, we're sending a full-scale military deputation to train and advise the Vietnamese People's Army, and you will be the leader of that deputation. Wei already had access personally to the top levels of the Chinese Communist Party, and now he could ask them for whatever and whomever he needed to make this thing work. Right away, he started sifting the PLA for officers who had the right qualifications to form advisory staffs for 3 full Vietnamese People's Army divisions and a faculty for a new Vietnamese Communist Military Academy. To get picked by Wei, you needed a very special skill stack. First, ties to Southeast Asia were a huge plus. It would have been great if he could have had all officers who knew the Vietnamese language, but that was asking too much. The PLA had access to a small number of ethnic Chinese people who had been born as Vietnamese nationals in French Indochina and through the fortunes of war had ended up taking refuge on the Chinese side of the border and then joined the PLA border units in that area. They had a few such people, but most of them were basically culturally and linguistically Chinese. And yes, they knew the Vietnamese language, but it was the kind of Vietnamese that you'd learn as a kid in a home where maybe one parent speaks Vietnamese. It's the kind of thing that let you talk about what's for dinner and what you should buy at the market. But when they put these people to work as interpreters in the field, they found out that was a far cry from having the kind of depth of vocabulary and the powers of abstract expression to talk about things like how you aim a rifle and use cones of fire from automatic weapons and defense in depth and artillery vocabulary and jargon. When they got down to it, they found the PLA had very few people who could really speak Vietnamese at, say, a college level. So they looked hard for people who had hometown connections to the borderland. Wei Guoqing was a great example. He was ethnically Zhuang, and although the Vietnamese people are not of the Zhuang ethnicity, the Zhuang are one of those small nationalities who can be found on both sides of the Chinese and Vietnamese border. And there would be people in the Vietnamese communist establishment who also were Zhuang, and they would have a sense of kinship and common language with Wei. Great. They looked for officers who were from the border regions or who were serving there. In my admittedly unscientific sample, I'm finding a huge number of officers who were drawn out of the Yunnan military district. And in fact, as we go through our story, we're going to see that much of the work of supplying the VPA, the Vietnamese People's Army, was being done by none other than our old friends or frenemies from the Yunnan military district's 13 Corps. If you don't know what I'm talking about, visit our episode about the Battle of Bridge 4 during the Sino-Vietnamese War of 1979, and you will see how 13 Corps really pooped the bed. They also needed people who had teaching experience. Again, like Wei Guoqing himself. Friends, let me tell you, teaching is a craft unto itself. Take a person who doesn't have teaching experience and put them in front of a classroom. Hilarity will not ensue. Lameness will ensue. For that matter, they also needed some officers who had schooling, enough that the Vietnamese could respect. Remember, the PLA was not an intellectual army. Wei Guoqing was pretty impressively educated by PLA standards because he had finished the 9th grade. In the meantime, in the Vietnamese People's Army, the officer corps was very well educated. They had had the benefit of a very good French public education system. General Giap had a wonderful French education. In his spare time, he played the piano and he read Shakespeare and Goethe and Tolstoy, at least after the war when he had leisure. Meanwhile, PLA culture was accustomed to officers who had grown up as semi-literate child soldiers in a land bathed with more blood than a Quentin Tarantino movie. I can assure you, the PLA officers were not like General Giap. They were not spending an evening in the drawing room playing Chopin nocturnes and reading aloud with their university professor wife from A Midsummer Night's Dream. So the Vietnamese officer corps plainly, if politely, looked down culturally on the PLA officers. So the Chinese advisors had to be people that the Vietnamese officers could respect culturally, and also militarily, they had to establish their bona fides. There was a sense among some of the Vietnamese cadets, reportedly, that sure, the PLA had done fine against the KMT for whatever that was worth, but they didn't know what a first class army like the French army could do. The Chinese advisors were going to have to win over their Vietnamese students. And for that matter, they were told again and again that they were going to need to be very, very diplomatic. See, the Chinese communist leaders understood perfectly well that by and large, Vietnam didn't really like them very much. And they had a lot of chips on their shoulders from centuries of dealing with China, this much bigger neighbor who was used to throwing its weight around and looking down on Vietnam as its little brother. They were very afraid that whoever they sent to Vietnam would get chauvinistic and uppity with the Vietnamese students and just further inflame the sense of ethnic rivalry between Vietnamese and Chinese people. In fact, this was such a huge concern that not only did Mao himself repeatedly hammer this home personally with the advisors that they were sending, but also Wei Guoqing decided that he needed a third man in his top leadership group. He had a good second in command, but he decided he needed an actual full-time military political diplomat. So he told the party leadership, look, if you want me to do this right and make sure that we build a relationship with the Vietnamese and don't just teach them how to use mortars and satchel charges, then you need to give me a top flight political officer. I know just the man, and he's down the road sitting in a hotel right now. Friends, an experienced officer named Deng Yifan was in Beijing, and he had just been given the job of a lifetime. It was not as an advisor to Vietnam. He was being brought to Beijing, and he was going to be given a cushy position in the General Political Directorate. It had all been settled, and his new boss told him, go on home, tell your wife the good news, pack her and your kids up, and bring the family to Beijing. As he was waiting for his train ride, he was approached by an aide-de-camp, saying, Sir, Vice Premier Liu Shaoqi needs to see you immediately. I have a car, come with me, please. And he was whisked across town into Zhongnanhai, the devil's own lair, where the number two man in the country told him, change of plan, we need you for something much more important. Deng was a good communist, understood exactly how important political work would be to managing this tricky new relationship, and he accepted on the spot. Of course, he knew that his wife would be displeased, and he was right. She divorced him. But that brings us to the last and perhaps most important qualification among the officers chosen by Wei Guoqing to be the first Chinese military advisors to Vietnam. That was ideology. They had to be willing to undertake hardships that were above and beyond the call of duty for someone else's fight. All of these guys had been through two consecutive wars, first against the Japanese, then against the KMT. Some of them had been fighting for over 20 years. Finally, they had the fruits of peace, and everybody wanted to enjoy them. But they were now being called on to forego that enjoyment and the happiness with their families that had escaped them for so long to go and help people in a country that wasn't just far away, but probably didn't even like them that much. In that room where Chairman Mao was personally addressing the 40 or so leaders of what was to be the Chinese Military Advisory Group, CMAG, you could tell that no one in the room thought this was a glamorous assignment or exciting or really anything good. Dou Jinbo was another guy who had had an assignment all lined up that he was super pumped about. He was about to go be a leading artillery officer in the liberation of Jinmen Island. And if you don't know what a fiasco that was, watch our episode about that. Just don't drink any beverages in front of your computer while you're listening to it, or you will ruin the electronics. But that was where Dou wanted to be. Then out of nowhere, he got switched to this crap mission and he was bummed. He later told an interviewer, I was grumbling to myself, do they even have artillery in Vietnam? The answer, friends, was no, they didn't, not until the PLA gave it to them. This was just about the time that the Korean War started cooking too. I'm sure there were people who were hoping that they could get into the thick of things there. In fact, later the advisory group was going to be joined by battlefield commanders who were just plucked right out of their commands in Korea. And as Mao was addressing these officers going to Vietnam, at one point he spotted a guy in the audience named Zhang Xinghua, some old coot that he'd known on the Long March. And he goes, hey, dude, I remember you. You all ready for Vietnam? And Zhang crisply answered, I resolutely follow the party's orders, which I think was like a Leninist way of saying, fuck my life. So Mao now gave them a big pep talk designed to make them understand they weren't being shunted off on some dumb mission. They weren't being sidelined. He told them Vietnam is going to be basically tropical Korea. That is, the imperialists lost round one. They lost China to the communist sphere. But they're not going to stop. They're going to try to take back Korea and they're going to try to take Vietnam and basically get back into China through the front porch and the back porch. And your job, advisors, is to stop that. He explained the Vietnamese are doing fine at guerrilla warfare. And he said, as you all know, our approach as Maoists has three phases. First, the revolutionaries do guerrilla warfare, then mobile warfare, and then they come to the third stage, which is what you have to teach the Vietnamese. Hard, organized, conventional warfare. And he told them, your job is going to be extra hard as well as extra important. You must do this in secrecy. Your presence there as PLA officers in Vietnam fighting against France is an escalation. You will not be discovered. You will not be captured, and you will not go near a front line where you can even be seen. You'll be dressed in Vietnamese People's Army uniforms. You'll use pseudonyms. You'll exercise the maximum of security. You have been chosen partly for your prudence and your discretion. Two, Mao said, you are there to advise and teach. You are not there to fight for them. You're there to build them up and do it in a culturally sensitive way. Don't be a jerk. Don't make us look like asses. Finally, he reminded them that as party members, they had a duty to what communists call internationalism. That is, solidarity with the oppressed working classes in all countries and not just their own. Just because China had won its own parochial national struggle against imperialism, that didn't excuse them from helping other countries now. They were going to give the Vietnamese People's Army the best of everything. They would be equipped with captured American weapons that would be better than anything that the PLA had in its own arsenal. They were going to give them the new 57 millimeter recoilless rifles, something that PLA units could only dream of experiencing. In fact, the Chinese advisors had never even seen these things before. But most importantly, these advisors would have to pay with their own happiness and the happiness of their own families. One of the advisors, a guy named Zhang Ying, was an instructor for military political officers. He got permission to stop on his way down to Vietnam in Guangdong because he had a daughter there who had been born during the war. She was 8 years old now, and he had never met her. He got to see her once, learn that she had no idea that he even existed, and then he had to be off again. Another officer, Wu Yongjun, he'd been another child soldier during World War II and the Civil War, and when he got his orders for Vietnam, he had just discovered his mom in Shanghai. They hadn't seen each other in 12 years. She thought he was dead, and she didn't even recognize him anymore. He wanted to stay with her in Shanghai, maybe make up the schooling that he'd missed as a child soldier, and above all, he wanted to search for his baby sister. When he was 9 years old, his parents had been forced to sell her for food. He was given a few days' leave to search for her. He made some inquiries and learned that he was too late. She had died a couple years before. He was mournful and shattered for a while. Then he let those feelings go numb. He compartmentalized them and he got back on that train. Determined, he said later, that he was going to go to Vietnam and make sure that some Vietnamese person there got the family happiness that he'd been denied. While those soldiers were on the slow train going south to Vietnam, they were given a mission statement for the new Chinese Military Assistance Group. It was to make their war our war. Goodbye to Harbin, hello Vietnam.
If you like this sort of content, I mean the lecturing, not the singing, please consider visiting our Patreon page, or like and subscribe. But the course remains free for all the world's workers, soldiers, and peasants.
The motherland has heard the bugle call from Hainan Island to the Great Wall. I don't suppose that war will ever end until we help them overthrow the French. I'll read the works of Chairman Mao Zedong. Goodbye, motherland, hello, Vietnam. We must spread communism in that land, or Chiang Kai-shek will take our country back. Goodbye to Harbin, hello Vietnam. Goodbye to China, hello Vietnam. Goodbye,
I export revolution,
to Harbin,
so the masses will learn
that
China is helping Ho Chi Minh in turn. We must drive out France now, at any cost, or the dubious blessing of planned economies and idolatrous utopian ideology will be lost.
Kiss me goodbye and write me while I'm gone. Goodbye to China, hello Vietnam.